Good evening. I'm Dick Clay, and I'm the president and CEO of the Filson Historical Society. We're so glad that all of you all are here this evening. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight Foster Ockerman Jr. Foster will be speaking about his book, Hidden History of Horse Racing in Kentucky. Foster, was Ronald Reagan who said he knew Thomas Jefferson. He was a friend of his, remember that? Well, Foster Ockerman is a friend of mine. We were in law school together. Precisely 43 years ago, we graduated in 1977. And it's a real pleasure for me to have him here tonight talking about hidden history of horse racing in Kentucky. He is a seventh generation Kentuckian, a native of Lexington, and a practicing attorney, as well as a historian and the author of 5 histories, including his most recent history of Lexington, which I want to see. His law practice over the past 40 years has covered business, real estate, nonprofits, healthcare, and equine law. In addition, now, he is the president and the chief historian for the Lexington History Museum, Inc., which is really pretty remarkable because it's online. I mean, much of it's online. If you go to it, it's really good and really fascinating. So, if you would, please join me in welcoming Foster Ockerman Jr. to the Filson.
There was racing down Main Street in Lexington in the 1780s. Now that's significant because the town wasn't platted. There weren't streets until 1782. The stories are that the tree stumps had not yet been removed from the street. Now, if you're not familiar with pioneer streets, they cut the trees down, but they left the stumps at a height just below the bed of a wagon. So you could drive a wagon down the street, and they'd come back and clear the stumps or let them rot out. But they were racing in Main Street. The town trustees called it a pernicious practice and a growing evil, and they banned it to the town commons. There was racing down Market Street in Louisville in 1783, and you all had the same problems. Kentucky became a state in 1792, and in 1793, in the middle of the first full year of statehood, the General Assembly saw fit to put a statewide ban on racing down streets. Now that's the beginning of racing in Kentucky, and it's part of what has gotten hidden in the past as we've developed the bigger tracks and the more important races. Got a question for you. How many know of Shippingport, Jefferson County? Okay, good, because nobody knows about it in Lexington. To remind you, it was founded in 1785. It was the mirror port to Louisville below the falls. So that all the shipping coming up unloaded at the imaginative named Shippingport and ported around to Louisville to go upstream and vice versa. And at one point, it actually was bigger than Louisville. It had a racetrack. Elm Tree Racetrack was at Shippingport. They had this big elm tree. They had a 300 diameter platform built around the tree. They had parties, they had bars, they had mazes, they had gardens to go through, and they had racing, and a 3-story hotel, a distillery, which was vibrant until the canal was dug in 1825, and that was the end of Shippingport because it wasn't needed anymore. And the track was partly taken by the canal, and the entire community shut down. I want to thank Dick for that nice introduction. I find it very interesting that he and I are both presiding over historical societies, historical organizations, although I have intense facility envy from what I've seen here today. I want to talk about the hidden history of horse racing in Kentucky in my book, which will be available afterwards, and I'll be available to sign. We're going to talk about the first professional athlete class in the United States. We're going to talk about a church that was built by horses, how the Oaks and the Derby got their names, and how it is really the Kentucky Preakness. Really, the Kentucky Preakness. Here are 6 of the more famous African-American jockeys, and by the way, the horse park in Lexington is doing an intense study of the African Americans in the equine industry, across breeds and across occupations, from the hot walkers to the jockeys to the trainers. Most of the jockeys pre-Civil War were in the South. Most of the tracks were in the South. There was a good reason for that combination. It was not a very smart plan to put a skilled rider on a fast horse in a free state. Not a good business plan. And the general pattern was that you would have a black trainer, and he'd recognize a young boy who seemed to have an affinity for horses and could sit well, and would train him to ride, and he would rise up to be a jockey, would ride until he got too big or too heavy or too old, and then he would retire from the track and become a trainer and identify the next young boy and bring on. So there was a cycle of African-American jockeys developing this way, and they were employment centers. The best jockeys would employ a number of trainers and riders and hot walkers in their own stables between races while they were riding. So it was a real employment center. The first of these on the top left is Alonzo Clayton. He was the youngest to ever ride in the Kentucky Derby. Oliver Lewis won the first Kentucky Derby, eventually was hired by bookies, and at the time a bookmaker was not only an approved lawful occupation, they actually were unionized. I have seen a letter from the Midwestern Bookmakers Association to the Kentucky Association track in Lexington, contracting to supply 20 bookies for the spring meet in the 1880s. He became the handicapper for the bookies and eventually became a successful bookie himself. Isaac Murphy, in 1887, was America's highest paid athlete. He made $12,000 that year. And that's NBA salary now. I mean, that's top stuff. These guys rode in good railroad cars. They were well dressed. They went to integrated parties at the racetracks. It truly was an amazing thing. He has a 44% win record, which still stands. Jimmy Perkins, his nickname was Soup. He got that nickname because he lived 3 or 4 houses away from the backstretch and would walk over to the stables every day and earn a little bit of money. And he'd go home for lunch, and when he came back, they'd say, "Jimmy, what'd you have for lunch?" He'd say, "Soup." And so that's how he got his nickname. He was the leading jockey in 1895. Willie Sims, I'm skipping a guy here, Willie Sims was number 1 in 1893. He also earned $12,000 in that year. But this is Jimmy Winkfield, and Jimmy is my favorite. He was born in Fayette County in the hamlet of Charlesburg, which no longer exists. He first rode at age 16 in Chicago, and it was a disaster. He didn't know what he was doing. He was all over the track. He got fined. But he got trained, and in 1901, at 19, he wins his first Kentucky Derby and wins 160 races that year, in addition to the other places. He won his second Kentucky Derby on Allen-a-Dale in 1902. He's the only African-American jockey to win the Derby in the 20th century. But there was a problem with this rosy scenario. The Jim Crow era was in full swing, and white trainers were trying to exclude black trainers, and white jockeys were trying to knock white jockeys off the track, and there were actually races where there was blows struck as they were coming around the far turn between the black and the white jockeys. 1903, right after he wins the Derby, John Madden hires Jimmy Winkfield to ride for him in a particular race, and Jimmy agrees to do it. Then he accepts a higher fee from another trainer. Madden is furious, and he threatens to keep Winkfield from getting any more races in the United States, and it works. Winkfield, remember, he had 160 wins the year before. He has 4 more mounts the rest of that year as Madden enforces his ban. Doesn't have a choice. Winkfield leaves for Europe in 1904 and starts getting rides over in Europe. By 1910, he gives up trying to get mounts in the U.S. completely, and then he hits gold. Jimmy Winkfield becomes the lead jockey for Tsar Nicholas II. He marries a white baroness. He's got a 2-story townhouse across from what is now Red Square, looking out on the Kremlin. He's got a white valet. And he is winning races all over Europe, Western Europe, and Russia. He wins the Warsaw Derby twice, the Russian Oaks 5 times, the Russian Derby 4 times, and he wins the Russian equivalent of the Triple Crown in 1 year, the Moscow, Warsaw, and St. Peter Derbies. This guy is on top of the world. And then the revolution comes. And the Bolsheviks are not real fond of rich man sports, including racing. Jimmy flees with his wife, 3 children, and 260 of the Tsar's best thoroughbreds. And he walks them across Europe. He gets to Poland first, they take a break there, walks them on over to Normandy, and by the time he gets to Normandy, the Romanovs are dead. He's got nobody to give the horses back to, so he does the natural thing. He keeps the horses and sets up his own breeding and racing stable in Normandy, France, and is very successful. He rides personally until 1930 and retires from riding at age 48. He dies at 93. In 1974, he's inducted into the Thoroughbred Hall of Fame in 2004. Now, I want to tell you how horses built a church. And it's a fascinating story. The time was 1923. Horse racing across the United States was under attack by the progressive social forces who had passed prohibition to stop sale of alcohol. Now they were going after gambling to stop the sin of gambling. And they were going to do this by outlawing parimutuel wagering across the country. Now that's, socially, morally, that's fine as far as it goes, but tracks made their money off the handle. And so if you eliminated gambling, you broke the track and you ended horse racing. Even August Belmont in New York could only buy the New York legislature for 1 year. And the next year, it was passed in New York. In 1897, there were 314 working tracks in the United States. It's about half of what we had pre-Civil War, but the southern tracks were decimated. By 1910, we were down to 23 tracks. And by 1923, there were 4. 2 in Illinois, 2 in Kentucky. Churchill and the Kentucky Association track in Lexington. Now, there was an Episcopal priest, an Englishman, Reverend Thomas Settle, who had come to Lexington after World War I. He was appointed to the Episcopal Church in Lexington and assigned the task of starting a mission church. And they had a little frame building on South Broadway, and it burned, and they were without a sanctuary and struggling as a congregation. Well, the Kentucky legislature is meeting in 23. A bill is filed to outlaw gambling in Kentucky. there is a public meeting in the courtroom at the Fayette County Courthouse, and lots of horsemen as well as other community members and Reverend Settles show up for this. And they're debating the bill. And Reverend Settles stands up to speak, and I want to read from the book. He told the people he knew firsthand the evils of bookmaking, having experienced bookies in Kentucky before entering the ministry. He said, with a bookmaker, the crooked owner can bet that his horse will lose. You can't do that with pari-mutuels. Before I went into the ministry, being an Englishman, I used to go to the races, and being an Englishman, I occasionally bet. The greatest fun I found in doing it was catching the bookmaker out of line. You can't do that with pari-mutuel wagering. He was giving a standing ovation, and he was invited to address the General Assembly, and he went to Frankfort. The bill to outlaw wagering in Kentucky passes. The governor vetoes it, and the veto is sustained by one vote. And so racing continued in Kentucky and Illinois, where it was not outlawed, until 1932, when the Depression had so strapped state government budgets that they were looking for money and realized that gambling revenues was a source that could be brought back, and they started legalizing gambling again across the country, setting up modern racing commissions and that sort of thing. And in the narthex, and this is the Church of the Good Shepherd at the entrance to Bell Court on Main Street in Lexington, in the narthex is a marble plaque that reads, "To the glory of God, this church is given to him by the lovers of horses from all across the country as a token of appreciation of their Father's goodness to his children." The horse industry offered Settle a car. He turned it down. They offered him $50,000 in cash. He turned it down, and they kept making offers, and finally he said, "Build me a church." And the thoroughbred industry built that church. One breeder offered up a horse for auction. Contributions came in not only from Belmont and the rich owners, but from the hot walkers and the grooms who sent in 50 cents and $1 because their jobs had been preserved by this man's speech before the General Assembly. And so if you happen to be in Lexington and happen to be going down Main Street, that is the church that horses built. Now we'll change tracks completely. I want to talk about how the Oaks and the Derby got their names, and this being Louisville, I expect some of you are ahead of me. This is Sir Edward Smith Stanley, the 12th Earl of Derby. The Earl was a horse breeder and many things. His colors of his silks were black with a white cap. Now, if you know anything about silks, you know these are very, very ancient silks. The first silks were solid colors. And to differentiate, they would introduce an element like a white cap. And later you get a diamond, you get stripes, you get various patterns. The more complicated the silks, the newer they are. The plainer the silks are, the older. He had ancient silks. The earldom is centuries old. In 1485, there was a young upstart by the name of Henry Tudor, who was challenging Richard III for the throne of England. There was a significant battle of Bosworth Field. Stanley and his brother were up on a hill watching. And when it became clear that Henry was about to prevail, they threw their troops and cavalry down into the fight on Richard's flank and carried the day. Naturally, he was rewarded with an earldom, and with that comes many great lands. In 1778, this earl was having a dinner party at his country estate. Now, when I say country estate, think Downton Abbey. And the local horsemen were there, and the conversation turned to horses and racing, and they were lamenting that there was not a good race for 3-year-old fillies. And they decided to have it at the local track. and they decided to name it after the Earl's estate, the Oaks. So the Oaks actually predates the Derby. It was so successful that the next year they decided to have a race for 2-year-olds. You see it coming. Legend has it they could not decide on a name. Lord Stanley was there, and Sir Charles Bunbury, who was head of the English and Irish Jockey Club. They were the 2 senior title holders. And by a coin flip, Stanley won, and after him, after Derby, or Derby as they say it there, it was called the Derby. It was first run in 1780. Now, the Earls of Derby weren't just interested in horses. The Stanley Cup is also named for this family. This is the 17th Earl. In 1935, he was invited to the Kentucky Derby. As far as I can tell, he's the only Earl of Derby to ever attend the Derby. He was invited to stay at Elmendorf Farm in Louisville. He arrived in New York City on the Aquitania. He was met by a Lexington horseman, Joseph Widener, who then owned Elmendorf, in a private railway car. They ran down to Washington, D.C., had dinner in the White House with President Hoover, and then came to Lexington on May 14th. Now, Elmendorf, you see the front of the farm there, on Paris Pike, the road from Lexington to Paris, we had an interurban rail system to the outlying communities from Lexington, and Elmendorf Farm actually was a trolley stop. Many of the farm workers lived in Lexington, would ride the trolley out to the farm. He had a huge dairy. But for our purposes, the other one, taken much later, is just as significant. At the back of the farm was the L&N Railway, and he had a private railway station. And to complete matters, he ran a track from the interurban track through the farm to the L&N Railway at the back. So when the Earl of Derby came to Lexington, and they came to the L&N station in downtown Lexington, gave a brief speech, got on the interurban trolley, no doubt a private one, ran out to Elmendorf and into the farm. That was on a Wednesday. They had parties in central Kentucky at various horse farms. And on Saturday morning, they board a private train from the Elmendorf station in the back, go to Frankfort where he makes a speech, goes on to the Derby, and had a private pavilion right down on the finish line to watch the Kentucky Derby. And he told reporters later this was the first time he had ever seen horses race on dirt, because all the English tracks are turf tracks. This is another picture of the Elmendorf mansion. A later owner tore it down except for the front columns because he was being charged too much in property tax. Here are some of the rooms that the Earl of Derby would have frequented while he was there at the farm. Now, this is the Woodlawn Vase. It's the original trophy, was 36 inches of solid silver designed by Tiffany's of New York City. And it was awarded at the Woodlawn racetrack here in Jefferson County. Woodlawn opened in 1859. It closed temporarily in 1862 and was a field hospital for the Union Army. 1865, it opens up again. But it closed in 1870. Now, this was a traveling trophy, and the winners in 1870 were from Brooklyn, New York. And of course, they took the trophy back with them, and there was no racing in 71 to bring the trophy back to. So it kind of wandered up and down the East Coast for a while until it landed there. In 1853, the Vanderbilts win the Preakness. But Mrs. Vanderbilt declines to take the trophy home. The demands for 24-hour security and insurance were more than she wanted to pay. And so the trophy today is in the Baltimore Museum of Art, and a 14 14-inch replica is given to the owner, jockey, and trainer. But it is truly the Kentucky Preakness because it is a Kentucky trophy that is awarded each year for the winner of the Preakness. And when you consider that August Belmont had a breeding operation in Lexington as well, we've got all three. We've got the Belmont, we've got the Preakness, and our home race, the Kentucky Derby. We own the Triple Crown. I want to give you one last nugget, and then I will open things up for questions. A chapter in my book deals with Henry Clay as a horse breeder, a thoroughbred breeder. He actually was more successful as a breeder than he was as a politician. He and 4 other men formed what an equine attorney, Richard Vemont, tells me was the first modern stallion syndicate. Typically at the time, you would buy a stallion for your own use. You might let your son breed to him or a neighbor or a good friend. But these men bought a stallion named Buzzard for the purpose of selling breedings in the modern sense. And Buzzard was quite a character. He was a good sire despite the fact he was blind in one eye and had a dislocated hip. And he had to walk all the way from Shenandoah Valley through the Cumberland Gap to Lexington because there was no vanning. There was no horse vanning at this time. There's more about all of this in that chapter in the book, but the takeaway is that every horse in the 2018 Kentucky Derby includes Buzzard in his or her ancestry. Every horse. So that's it. That's the preview of the book and the hidden history of horse racing in Kentucky. Working on the next book, which will come out probably next spring, The History Lover's Guide to Lexington and Central Kentucky. Thank you, Dick.
Thank you. We have time for questions. I have a mic, and I'm going to try to get the mic to you. If you have a loud voice and can shout it out, Foster, if you would repeat it, that's fine. Otherwise, you won't need to with this.
Foster, were there Caucasian jockeys back at the same time that these great African-American jockeys?
They were. There were Caucasian jockeys. There were no Hispanic jockeys, not aware of any Native American jockeys, but the African-American jockeys dominated the profession at the time.
Foster, you mentioned that some progressive political forces had led to the outlawing of horse racing and other gambling. Do you think maybe we ought to reconsider whether they were progressive political forces or not?
If you heard, the question is, should we reconsider calling them progressives if they tried to outlaw gambling? I'm going to leave that to the historians of that era. They have been labeled, and too many books have been written to change the name.
Foster, I do have a question, and that is the evolution of Keeneland. Could you talk to us about that a bit?
I've got a chapter on early tracks in Kentucky, and we go into more detail in there. The Kentucky Association track in downtown Lexington was set up in 1826. It was the second oval track in Lexington. The first was at the back of what is now Lexington Cemetery. And it successfully raced up until 1932, when the effect of the Great Depression finally closed the track. The horsemen were not willing to allow there not to be a track, and a group of them got together and started looking for another site. John Keene had at his Keene farm on Versailles Road was one of these, and he ultimately decided to sell a large piece of land and where he was building a training track to the newly formed Keeneland Association. And so 4 years later, in 1936, the present Keeneland Association track held its opening meet. And it just in the last 5 years, I think, has acquired the Keene House itself as now as a meeting house and facility to combine all of that together. But that's the change from the old K8. And incidentally, the gate post at the entrance to Keeneland that has KA inside a wreath, a winner's wreath, that's not Keeneland Association, that's Kentucky Association. They took the old gate post from the downtown track and moved it out to the gate post at the entry of Keeneland. Red Mile started, obviously, the Trotz breeders wanted their own track. It is phenomenally interesting that the owners of the breeds rarely cross over. They've got their own social worlds, they've got their own track, they've got their own breeds, and the thoroughbreds and the saddlebreds and the standardbreds rarely interact. It's a strange phenomena in Fayette County. I'd have to look it up. It's in the book. I don't remember the year it started. They first had a track down where the student center is at UK. The Union Army occupied that. The grandstand caught fire, and they moved out South Broadway to the current Red Mile location and started it's the Kentucky Trotz Association that owns it. And they had fairs and other breed races, but it became the trotting track, and famously one of the 3 top trotting track races in the U.S. I want to, before I quit, give a shout out to the Keeneland Library. I had probably the best 3 days of my life that did not involve my wife researching at the Keeneland Library. It's a beautiful facility, well lit. I let them know 2 weeks ahead of time what I was looking for, and when I arrived, they had a book cart and files and books and a table reserved for me, and it was an absolutely terrific resource for equine research and equine history. And you just can't imagine what it's like on a June day, on a beautiful morning with no clouds, to be the only car on the Keeneland campus driving up to the library to spend a day researching. It was wonderful.
I have a question for you, and maybe this will spur further talk, and it's general. I mean, you've got Keeneland and the Red Mile. We have the Derby. Sometimes, though, even though the two cities are 70 miles and an hour and 15 minutes apart, if you drive like I do, why is there this seeming distance sometimes between the two cities? What has caused that historically? Or is that something in my imagination?
We're kind of going broadly afield from horses here.
I know, but you've written this History Lover's Guide to Lexington.
Right. Okay, there's the tee up. Here we go. Well, it's commercial jealousy. Lexington was the first big commercial center in Kentucky and dominated. The road came down from Maysville, originally called Limestone, and before that Mulberry, but the road came down from Maysville, which is the major port coming out of Philadelphia before Cincinnati was established, to Lexington. It came from Huntington to Lexington. It came from Cumberland Gap over the Wilderness Road to Lexington. And one road went to Louisville. And Louisville was an outpost early on when Lexington was called the Athens of the West, with 2 universities, a lot of private schools. And then the steam engine came along. And that made steam traffic upriver possible, and that made Louisville a center of commerce because it was cheaper to go downriver to Louisville, portage to shipping port, go down to New Orleans, and reverse, come back up, and commerce started going that way. And then Lexington was struck in 1833, just as this balance was shifting with a major cholera epidemic And that put, the ugly stick hit Lexington. I mean, a tenth of the population died. It was indiscriminate. And in fact, Lexington's reputation as a major slave market began with the foreclosures that were the result of people dying and not being able to pay their debts, and the farm was sold, and the horses were sold, and the slaves were sold at the courthouse steps. So Louisville's coming up. Lexington is losing its mojo here, and there began a competition between them that continued on to the Civil War, when Lexington, as somebody famously said, waited until the war was over and joined the losing side. But Louisville was heavily Union. Lexington was more Southern oriented, so there's another period of competition. And then from there on, it's economic, and that really was where the competition came in. There probably are some political elements in there that I don't have handy. He was listing the Elm Tree track at Shippingport, Woodlawn in East Jefferson County, and you named one more, Douglas Park, and Oakland. Oakland and Douglas Park were on the railroad track and had their own stops, which was why they were located there. They had all closed by the post-Civil War period, and the Jefferson County horsemen sent a delegation to Europe to figure out how to run a successful track, and they discovered the Oaks and the Derby. And it's not just us and England, folks. There's an Italian Derby, there's a French Derby, there was a German Derby, the Warsaw. All these derbies were successful marketing tricks, and so they came back, leased land from the Churchill brothers, and established Churchill Downs with the Derby and the Oaks as the key races. Well, you're exactly right, and the history of racing in America started off with quarter-mile straight track runs. And so that's why they were racing down streets. An oval track takes a lot of land, and you've got to clear a lot of land. You can't just run the track around. You've got to cut down all the trees and devote good agricultural land to only racing. So you had to have a lot of money, and you had to have a lot of land. I think it was 1806, earlier, Whitley, I've lost the county right now, had an oval track. He had a hill, small hill, and he ran a track around that hill, and you actually went into the infield and sat on the hill to watch the track. He was a colonel in the Revolutionary Army, got several thousand acres as a result of his service, and that's where he built his fortune. So anti-British. The Brits run their tracks clockwise. And he was so anti-British that he started running races counterclockwise. And that practice sustained in the United States. Lexington's first oval track was the Williams Brothers track. As I said, it was the back of what is currently the Lexington Cemetery. It's hard to imagine if you know the cemetery because it's rolling hills, but you get back into the back part of it and a little subdivision at the back, and it flattens out. And they were able to, they formed a local jockey club. Henry Clay was one of the original members of the Lexington Jockey Club, which I think is second after New York in the country. And then people started building, got the land, got the money to build bigger tracks. Yeah, Crab Orchard has an interesting history, incidentally. It's a little, does it have a stoplight now? But it was the end of the Wilderness Road. And so when you were coming through Indian Territory to central Kentucky, when you got to Crab Orchard, you got to civilization. And Methodist Bishop Francis Asbury, after his first trip to Lexington, there was an advertisement that a group was going east and encouraging others to join with them and bring rifles to go through Indian Territory. So Crab Orchard was a big resort. It was a major vacation spot, and not just a track, but a big hotel. I mean, Crab Orchard has a heck of a history behind it. question is, what is more predominant? Is a racetrack surface, dirt, or grass or turf? It was just an American thing to, racing started out cross-country and eventually worked itself into organized tracks, and it just became the preference in the United States to have a dirt track. In England and Europe, the tradition of racing on grass was not interrupted. Now, of course, you've got turf tracks at the dirt courses, and I don't know if the English tracks have a dirt course corresponding to that or not. There are debates among trainers as to what's safer. Is it safer to run over natural ground or safer to run over dirt that has been plowed and loosened and better drainage and everything that goes into designing a race course today?
All of these in antebellum and then really after the Civil War in Kentucky, there were these agricultural and mechanical fairs in different counties across the state. And you can buy coin silver julep cups with the particular county. So I know of one with Henderson, Union, Hopkins County on it. And they would give these as prizes for the best horse, the best cow, maybe for tobacco or corn. And I wonder if that's how some of these racetracks originated out in the state. I don't know.
That would be the case, Dick, that it's the local competitions, the local fairs, and they would have certainly horse shows and cattle shows and that kind of agricultural fair going on. And if they could afford to get enough land for a big track, then they would have a racetrack too. At one time, I believe I'm correct in quoting this. I didn't put it in my book, so I can't verify it, but I think there were, at one time, this is Kentucky, there were more racetracks than basketball gyms.
I'll say that my family goes back in Henderson, 6 generations, and my dad made money to help put himself through college by playing the piano at the Club Trocadero, which was right across Highway 41 from Ellis Park.
Okay, any more questions?
Oh, so much for coming. Thank you. That was